think we have 40 to 50 people who are joining us electronically. My name is Ann Martin, and the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to take your cell phone and put it on silence or almost silence or something like that, because we have a lot of material to cover today. I'm on the board of the Center for Lifelong Learning, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the board and on behalf of our board of directors, who is led by John Feldman, who's over here doing the technical responsibilities. And if you'll permit me just a brief commercial, I'd like to tell you about the Center for Lifelong Learning. We have brochures at the back on the table, so if you haven't seen one, please pick one up. We offer a wide selection of educational opportunities for us as residents. We offer both classes and special events on a myriad of subjects. Just a few examples: topics on health, technology, philosophy, music, literature, history, science, world events. It's kind of tough to compete with technology, isn't it? As I was saying, world events, art, drama, and we have ongoing language classes. So please, if you haven't already, pick up one of our brochures, and especially if you've not taken a class or been to an event sponsored by CLL, please think about that. Before we begin, let me give you a bit of background about today's program. The Center for Lifelong Learning has designed a series of programs that we call Community Conversations. Information on upcoming conversations will be published, of course, in the Leisure World News. But what better way to begin the series than an overview of Leisure World governance? The intent of this first conversation is to provide a foundation of information about this broad community that we all share, as well as the mutuals, the different mutuals in which we live. Our speaker today, I believe, is very uniquely qualified to do this program and to discuss the intricacies of Leisure World governance, as he has been and still serves as a leader on both his mutual and the corporate levels. He's been a resident of Mutual 10 for 11 years, and he's been served on its board for over 10 years. So as you can see, as soon as he moved here to Leisure World, he got very busy. He served as chair of the Leisure World Corporate Board of Directors for 3 years, on the executive committee for 6 years, and continues even today as director. He's a member of a number of Leisure World clubs, so he knows our community both as a leader and also as a participant in its amenities. And currently, he is the leader of the Diversity Relations Council. Paul is a graduate of Towson State University, and in his professional life, he was a teacher and public speaker for a trade association. That's all I'll mention, because I think as part of his PowerPoint presentation, he has a, do they even say slides anymore, or a PowerPoint page with more detail of his bona fides. And if you have questions, we'd like for Paul to have an opportunity to go through his entire presentation, but he can take questions at the end. So if you would, join me in welcoming Paul Eisenhower. Let's bring him on.
Well, it's good to see everybody here, and I'm glad the Center for Lifelong Learning is allowing this to happen. I think it's frustrating not to know how things are working. You don't have to know every little thing, but generally what's going on. So I put this presentation together with the residents in mind, but I had two challenges. One was, the understanding that people have right now could be from 0 to 10. So I said, well, I want to tell them some stuff, but not overdo it. I mean, I'm not training you for a test. Just, I want to give you a real sense of what's going on here. And the second challenge I had was as much to me as maybe all of you, was I can easily go off on tangents. I can easily say, that reminds me of the time, and go on like that. Well, I've really had to work on all behave, don't, just tell them what they need to know. So I'll be speaking to the slides, so don't go off too far. And as I mentioned, I'll be happy to take questions after I'm done, and provided they're about this subject related to full governance, not everything out there, in Leisure World, just the governance part of it. Okay, so anyway, what we're gonna do here, I'll be sitting here and mention to Ann when to move on. Like I said, it's gonna be a high-level overview of the governance. It's to give you a sense. There's a lot of moving parts around Leisure World. Many of them are in governance, and that's what we'll talk about today. Those that aren't in governance, I'll mention. Generalities, like I said, I think I'll be talking in general. I won't be drilling down into how this works, all the nuances. And the future changes, I just want to address at the beginning or acknowledge that our general manager, our new manager, Bob Kimball, he's given a future vision. He's presented his vision of changes or changes here or there that he thinks would help. Now, certainly, in his purview, he has already started making the changes. Other changes will take more discussion, but let's say the direction of all the changes are to help Leisure World. And everything I've put on here takes all that into account. So it's not like I'm jumping the gun. I know what's being said. And towards the end, after I get through the governance part, I want to discuss how the system can be navigated. Many people may think, gee, it's such a big bureaucracy, it's a wonder anything ever gets done. Well, this will show you how things have been done for the residents. Questions and answers, like I said, I'd be happy to answer any right now or at the end. But if you ponder and think of any and you want to check, you can email me at joebt@lwm10.com, and I'll get back to you right away pretty much. So feel free. Next thing. Okay, now you've already really heard about me, and I'm not real comfortable talking about myself, but I know you want to know who is this who thinks I can tell us about the governance. So I wanted you to know my background, and certainly while I've been here, I've chaired advisory committees, special committees. I've chaired the board of directors, been on the executive committee. Since I was chair, I've kind of pivoted my interest into some of our cultural groups. I lead the Diversity Council, Diversity Relations Council. I'm with Friends of India. I'm in lead back for African Americans, the Chinese Club, the Edmondson Society, Center for Lifelong Learning, and the Leisure World Foundation. I'm also webmaster for the external websites for Mitchell's 10, 16, 19B, 20B, and the Jewish Club. I own the listserv for Leisure World. So anyway, the point is, I'm a very committed resident. I've been in governance, sure, but I'm a resident before anything else. That's how I came here. Okay, next. And before we start, I just want to, not ground rules, but get us on the same page. I do not speak for Leisure World. There's no official position I'm taking. I hope I don't give opinions. If I do, They'll be brief and I'll frame them as such, okay? This is an informative class. It's a presentation of the government. The resident forums are, priority is really for resident input, and it can be on a myriad of subjects. This is on one subject that I'll be presenting. And I don't want to feel like I'm defending any specific policy or contract. This board of directors, they do all voting, and like everything in every election in America, we don't ask them afterwards why they voted the way they did. So I can't speak for anybody. And one more thing, just out of courtesy and privacy, there'll be no names or performances brought up here. You have to be careful when people say Joe Blow's not doing a good job or is doing. We don't want to even deal with that kind of thing. All right, next. Now, sort of before I begin with governance, let me stress the mutuals. Because obviously they're very high profile because you all live in a mutual. Mutuals are not part of collegial governance. They're part of their trust that I'll talk about shortly. But they're their own independently incorporated governing bodies. The residential HOAs, they're not part of collegial governance. Cog versus a wheel. I was thinking of maybe an analogy. If you look at the front wheel on a bike, it spins around. Okay, the mutuals are all members. They're all part of that wheel. But the governance of the fork, that fork that holds it together, without the fork, you can't spin. The fork is the collegial governance. So the mutuals are not actually part of collegial governance. They all have their own separate rules, and with all their governing documents, it's spelled out in the governing documents, but essentially mutual governance and collegial governance don't mix. They're separate. There's one slight intersection between them, and that's more an obligation. And I'll mention that later on. But generally speaking, they just don't mix. Next one. Okay, now this gives you, these are the 5 entities of collegial governance. And I'm going to talk about each one of them. But this gives you the relationship. You have the collegial community corporation, the board of directors, it's up at the top. That would be your umbrella. Okay, that's at the very top. And then we have a relationship, certainly the executive committee, the advisory committees, and special committees that I'll be talking about. I mentioned Leechboro, Maryland Corporation. Like I said, we have a relationship with all these entities, of course. But we work more in tandem with the Leechboro Board or Management Corporation. Say up top at the board level, we're setting the policy and the rules, but the management company, to me, they're like boots on the ground. They execute those policies and rules. So we really have to work in tandem, and we do. And we work in tandem with all of them, but we have a very close working relationship there. Next. And again, just a little bit of an aside, but all the governing documents of Leechboro that I'll be speaking about are located on the resident website, residents.lwmc.com. This is where I really encourage everybody to sign up, create a Passant account for that. You know, it's mentioned someone, when I first came here, the only way to find things out was pencil and paper, TV, or newspaper. Well, now we have other avenues. This is more electronic, but everything is up there. It may be a whole lot of stuff, sure, but everything is up there. And recently, to me, the most important thing is these email blasts that the management sends out every week or so, or when something important, you know, the newspaper is good. It's a very good publication. But like all periodicals, there is a time lag. You know, you have things that happen right in the middle that you might want to know about. These blasts.
We are not seeing the slides.
Okay, I will check on it.
So anyhow, these email blasts let you know some important things that as residents really want to know about. And the only way you can get the blast is if they have email. And to give me your email, you really have to send an account for the resident database or resident website. But you also have to, you can optionally give your email because some people would rather not. Okay, but the only way to get these email blasts is if you give them your email. And I just highly suggest that as a way to get knowing what's going on next. Okay, now where did they get the authority? Now I'm gonna hesitate to compare literal governments to the federal government in the United States, only because there's a lot of similarities, but there are dissimilarities. So, but one thing that's common about in the United States, you have the U.S. Constitution that created the government. And that's where all our laws and government grow from. Well, same thing in Israel. We're not using the Constitution, they call ours the trust. Okay, from the trust, everything grows. Okay, now that trust was created within the legal framework of the United States, but the trust is a legal entity, and that's where everything comes from. And just an aside, and I bring this up, I didn't really know where to put this slide, so I'm putting it here. And the reason I wanted this is I've noticed a lot over the years, a lot of confusion is stemming from a feeling people have that, well, if our democracy is done like the federal democracy, it's wrong. And you just can't, you can't be comparing that, because democracies are, they're just governments that are representative of people's input. Well, there's indirect or direct. It's a democracy that represents the people. But there are many models of a democracy. Each model was created by the founders. That's who determined how they're set up. For instance, the US and India have democratic republics. England and Israel, parliamentary democracies. And closer to home, we have the state government and the federal government. They operate very differently in governance and democratic. In the federal government, you have the popular vote and the electoral vote. So people can reasonably wonder, well, what's a popular vote for? Because the electoral vote determines everything. In state, it's more direct. Your popular vote will elect your governor. And of course, financially, the federal government can run on a deficit. The states can't do that. So just keep in mind, the comparing this or that, different democracies don't do that. Because if they're not right or wrong, they're the way they were set up. Okay, now the way the Leisure World Trust was set up, back in 1966, the trust being a legal relationship which the holder of right gives another person the entity who must keep and use the soul for the other's benefit. That was set up, again, that bicycle wheel, that's the trust that was set up then. The trustee, these are just terms that you might hear occasionally, but they're good to know. The trustee is the person or the organization who manages the assets of the trust. Going back to that kind of cooperation between LWMC, LWCC, we have the policies and then the boots on the ground to execute the policies. Okay. All policies stem from the trust. Okay. The trust is the bottom line. That's where everything comes from. A trustor is an individual or organization that gives funds or assets to others by transferring fiduciary duty to a third party. The trustors are, in this case, they're the mutuals. That bicycle wheel that goes around is made up of mutuals. Each one is a member of the trust. They're not part of the FARC, which is the government, they're part of the trust. If I were to underline a word, legal, it's legally binding. Everything had to go through lots of lawyers and through the courts to get approved. So the government was set up with all the legal framework of the United States. With LWCC, the Community Corporation, we cannot, and when I say we, I'm talking about the board of directors, I guess, cannot amend the trust. They just can't do that. The board of directors it's not a member of the trust, it's the government body. So it can't do anything like that. The LWMC, the Management Corporation, they deal more with the day-to-day administration, operations of the trust. They keep the ball going. Okay, one thing you mentioned about the trustor. See, in the trust, they have different rules, different laws that we have to obey. One is that nobody can do everything. Everybody can do something, but nobody can do everything. I was mentioning, Jim, before that, recently we changed our sales fee from 2 to 3% when you sell a home. The electoral board had nothing to do with that, except for administering the voting. It was all the mutuals, and the trust explicitly says that the board cannot change only the mutuals of the people who live here. Oh, and that's another thing too. I'll start back with what I've heard a lot of people say. They look at the management folks, the staff, they'll say, well, I paid their salaries, they should do what they. That's true in a very indirect way. You're a resident, okay? You're a unit owner of your mutual. You pay your contribution to your mutual. If you're delinquent, you get a notice from your mutual. That leaves your role. The mutuals, when they entered into this trust agreement, they agreed, yes, we're gonna pay a membership fee and then monthly dues. They pay leisure role, okay? The residents don't. It's the mutuals that were independently incorporated. They are the members. Residents, you're unit owners of your mutual. If, say, in a budget year, it finishes and there's a surplus, for instance, that surplus is refunded, can be refunded to the members, which are the mutuals. You don't refund the residents, refund the mutuals. Residents, if you looked at the entire trust document, you can. It never once mentions residents. I think in the bylaws it refers to residents as unit owners, but either way, the member is the mutual. Unit owners, we come, we go, you know, we're just unit owners, residents of the mutual. Next. Okay, now we've talked enough about the trust. Trust is that basic building block. Okay, but from the trust, they also have another document. It's the bylaws. They're like rules for operating the community. And they're different. They're a little more specific. Okay, but so we have those. And it's, like I said, literal incorporation policy or operation bylaw. Adhere to and conform to the trust directives. Bylaw, everything. You can't, it's hard to conflict with the trust. The main purpose of the literal bylaws is to issue rules for the use and preservation of facilities and properties in leisure role for participation activities managed by the corporation. I'll mention an example. Back in 1966, there was no such thing as Comcast. There was no streaming, so obviously there are things that change over time the trust didn't address. But they did address in general that we can't sign contracts that, you know, enable this community to function. And that's what the board does. They take the original documents and they kind of massage what is needed right now. We'll talk about how the board functions in a bit. Okay, next. So anyway, who's the boss? Like I said, the board follows the trust. Or the literal board executes the will of the trust. The trust is a static legal agreement, like I said, it's the board that's going to take that agreement and kind of apply it to the needs of today. That's where they get their authority and their tasking and working for the residents. I put this down here because I think it kind of it's a statement that gives you a lot of idea of where we're coming from on the board. It's from Lewis World Articles of Incorporation, and it says, insofar as permitted by law to do any other thing that, in the judgment of the board of directors, will promote the business of the corporation and the common benefit of its members. So like I said, we have our marching orders from the trust, but we will take and apply them to today's needs. Next. Okay, getting to the board of directors. Leisure World Board of Directors, LWCC is the umbrella HOA. as far as pure governments, I think of them as non-residential umbrella HOA, because there are residents, you know, the clubhouses or anything. The residents are in the mutual, so I think of the umbrella, the board of directors as a well, they deal with the residents, but LWCC in general, I think that it's non-residential. We supervise the ongoing activities of an organization, a group of individuals that represent the member units, and it's an equitable representation of each mutual, which explains why the way they created it was to give, say, every mutual a significant voice in what's going on. Because we got some really little mutuals and we have some really big mutuals. But they're both members, and the trust and the bylaws, they wanted to assure that we hear from everybody, kind of faithfully. Technically, what for every 250 units, you can have a representative on the board. Now, for most of us, 250 units is our whole mutual, so we only have one direct representative. Some of the really large mutuals, and Montgomery Mutual being the largest by far, they have 4 directors, because they have 250 amounts that they can have. But most of us have one. So we do get that rather level playing field for representing our mutuals. Next. But one thing to keep in mind, and I found this out when I became chairperson, that there are a lot of, I mean, I know it beforehand, but I really had to learn it when I got to be chair, but there are a lot of external rules that we have to follow, aside from the trust. Number 1 is the federal laws, for instance, discrimination housing. That goes for everybody in this whole country. But more specific, aimed at the homeowner association, the Maryland HOA Act, okay, that set of law, those are laws of the legislature in Maryland that we have to follow, and they're legal, so we gotta do it. And we do it, but everything has to be kept in mind with that. Now, Montgomery County Commission on Ownership Communities, usually called CCOC, they've kind of helped me out as far as they take all the laws, and there are other laws aside from the Maryland HOA, there's like the open meeting laws, they take all merit laws and boil them down to a little easier to read format for me. They also have quasi-enforcement powers from the courts, mostly in the area of an HOA. So there are rules, all I got to do is follow them. If you don't follow them, they're there to slap your hand or more, and they can do more. Oh yeah, and as far as conducting, facilitating a board meeting, there's an elder set of rules. According to our bylaws, okay, they go through this and the other, and when they get to the board meeting, it says, well, it would take forever to put down all the rules, so just follow the current edition of Robert's rules. Robert's rules is like a set of rules, it's like a parameter facilitating meetings, the order in which things should go, what's acceptable, what's not. So there are a lot of rules that the board has to follow. Like I said, nobody can do everything. Yeah, there are rules about everything out there. Next. And I mentioned before that, you know, each mutual is entitled to representation, but more specifically, with that 250 units, you get one. For every 250 units, the larger units do get more representation, but we're all getting pretty much the same. And this is where I get real careful, all because of those of you who are aware of that lawsuit that began 3 years ago, and it's over now. But because I started very close to when I began my chairmanship, it lasted almost all the way through my chairmanship, so I was always very aware of it. And I have my own opinions that I'm trying to keep to myself, but let's say essentially, it was a lawsuit against this one. This was the crux of their very first complaint. The board can only recommend, Mitchell determines representative terms. So the crux was how the mutual representatives are chosen. Are they elected or selected? And that was the crux. I think there was some misunderstanding of the interpretation of what's a unit owner versus a trust member. One is a resident, but one is an incorporated mutual. And I think there was some overlap there. One thing it did do was tell me I knew a little more about law than I thought. The first iteration of their complaint, it listed every single board member as a defendant, and they being one. But then it went on to say they were representing all residents of Ledgerville, of which I am one. So I was thinking, you mean I'm a plaintiff and a defendant in the same lawsuit? Didn't think that could happen, so that had to be amended, and that was removed. It was just against Ledgerville. But the bottom line to that is 3 courts have upheld the Ledgerville's governance. It started at Circuit Court, went to the County Court or Circuit Court of Appeals, Maryland Appeal Court, and each one of them sided with Ledgerville. So that's over. And our governance will proceed as it always has. As far as the board of directors, we have 3 officers and an executive committee that are elected, and the rest of everyone else is a representative of the board. Ledgerville can't do anything about the representatives of the board. That's all up to the meeting. In fact, if a board member went rogue or didn't like something or other, the most we could do is pass a resolution to suggest to the mutual to recommend that they remove the representative. We can't do it because their governance is what assigned their representative. We have no right to interfere with their government. So there are all the directors are representative, but of those directors, you have 3 officers elected, you have an executive committee elected by the board, the chairman, vice chair, secretary, and the at-large members. And they're all looking at this community. Everything they decide on or think about is in best interest of everybody. I'll address what I think might be a question is, why don't they represent the people of their region? The easy cop-out way of answering would be, well, it wasn't set up that way. But really, when a representative goes to the mutual, you have now put on a new hat. You are now looking at the best interests of Lateral residents. Although you're no longer in your mutual governance looking at your own residents. If it had to do with representing your own mutual, that would be almost mixing the two governments, which we cannot do. Okay, next. As far as the board meetings, they are open to all Leitchville residents. They're not open to the world. You know, we have gates, so they're open to Leitchville. That's why there's the Open Meeting Act that doesn't always apply to Leitchville. We have other things we have to comply with. We comply with all applicable laws. All our meetings are conducted using the current Roberts rules. The chair is responsible for the agenda and facilitating the meeting. The board has imposed parameters to ensure business meeting is the priority. For instance, limiting all input. You see, the board meetings and all the government's been their business meeting. That's their priority, business. Now, we are told we have to have an open forum for resident input, and that's good. But they have given us the authority to put that within the workings of our meeting. So we actually have internal rules. For instance, a person can, in open forum, it has 2 minutes. Because if, in theory, you have 8,000 residents, if they just yak, we'd never get anything done. So there are some constraints, and we have a little bit of authority. If one of them, if the chair starts singing, they're beating a dead horse. Everyone's saying the same thing in a different way. Then the chair has a little discretion to let's get going. Because a lot of times that happens even on the board, just anybody. Next. And as far as the voting goes, each director has a vote. I'm not saying each mutual has a vote, because San Montgomery Mutual has 4, because they have so many units. But each director that is present gets 1 vote. And on most issues, the simple majority wins. You know, we get a hand count, boom, there you go. But there are some issues that require a supermajority. If somebody comes to the board meeting, and that would be a director, and says, I want this motion be considered and voted on. Well, I'll tell you in a bit why that's the problem, but to get that simple on the agenda will take a supermajority vote. And then we even discuss it in a separate issue almost. So there are some supermajority instances, and some you require both the majority, both the director and a weighted vote. That would be like for the election of officers. You have to have that hand count majority, sure. But then you also have to have the number of units that hand count represents added up. So that is somebody like Montgomery Mutual or one of the bigger high rises, they have a lot of units. That means their rate of vote is going to be very important because they could easily sway an election because of their size. So there are some instances when you do need that. Not every instance, but some. Next. Okay, like I said, the ongoing governance. We know by now the trust document, I call them trust, but the bylaws and trust together are governing documents. Okay, we know that they're the basic building block, and the board just takes the parameters and massage them to today's needs. And the way we do it usually is creating a policy through resolution. A resolution is an original motion which, because of its importance, length, or complexity, is submitted in writing. The bylaws, which were passed down by the trust, okay, they're corporate rules of operating the organization. Resolutions might be an extension of that. Given what the bylaws is, there might be more specific needs that it doesn't address. And the board of directors can only affect the policy of the bylaws, not the trust documents. Like I was saying, that 2 to 3% increase, that which governing documents, the board cannot change that. The official to that. Okay, next. And the Litchfield Community Corporation Executive Committee, what they do essentially is they prepare, coordinate, and otherwise facilitate the work of the board. They're very important as a gatekeeper of information to the board. I don't want motions going to the board that are partly written or unclear and waste time. You know, where we start talking about semantics. I don't want that. Everything has to go to the executive committee first. They're the gatekeepers. And also an real important thing to do. The board of directors, they're at a high policy level, but a lot of our policy has got to be, can't be innovative. They have to be consider the managing of the policy. For instance, if we told our management company, well, we want to do X, and then the management company comes back and says, of course we can do it, but we're going to have to hire many more people to do it, which is going to cost money. Well, it would have been nice if I'd known that. So if you go to a board meeting or executive committee, you'll notice the literal GM is always there, because we can't make our decisions in vacuum. We need that person's input. And so when you see him there, he's not a voting member, no, but he's very important to hear the input so we can make a better decision. And like I said, the board of directors are way up here. Management, we need the executive committee, logistically, they can monitor what's going on in the management more than the board can, and we need to know that. Personally, too, one thing they do is say when you're sharing, you're a single person. Your opinion is an opinion. They're like you can bounce ideas off. Many times I have to hear what they all say, because sometimes I'm way off, or I missed a rule or something. Now, the executive committee, they can be authorized by the board. They can't be given the authority to make all the decisions. But in reality, the board is rightfully very reluctant to do that. But the board of directors represents the people, all the people of Litchfield. The executive committee, there's only 7. We can't represent every single, mutual. So the board is reluctant to do that. The only time it ever happened in my time as chair was when the pandemic started, for the first 3 months, it was an extra shutdown. Well, so for the board to meet during the shutdown, 34 members was logistically not going to happen. So they did give the authority to the executive committee for X amount of time, but they gave us parameters. You can only make these sort of decisions. And once this time frame is over, you give us back the authority. So board of directors is always in charge, but there could be an emergency where they could actually authorize the executive committee. Next. And the advisory committees, they're one of the entities, and it's very important. I'll be coming back to why it's very important to have this and be aware of it. Each committee was created by the board to advise and assist it. Charter committee rules are approved by the board. They're like an arm or an extension of the board. We can't possibly at the board level focus on every single function within the community. So we have advisory committees who specialize in that function. And they'll look at it and report to us and communicate with us. Now, they're not HOA, but they're an extension of the HOA governance. So they have to adhere to all the rules and all the laws that the board has to adhere to. The difference between the advisory committee and special committee, the advisory committees are chartered as standing committees. So they meet once a month. Because there's a function in the community that is very ongoing, and we need to keep on top of it. That would be like PBD or the restaurants or that sort of thing. The special committees are a little more focused. The board had a task, and they said we want to pick a group of folks who are qualified to deal with this and report to us. Right now we have 2 special committees. One is the IT committee, which is really good. I call them one for heavyweight committees because they are so qualified. Techie Talk, which is above me, so I think they're heavy. The other one is the strategic plan. I'll talk about that in a bit. But those folks are very focused on one task, and when that task is over, they're done. The standing committees are ongoing, but the special committees are just that one task, and that's it. But keep in mind, you have all this committees, all fun and good, but the final word of any issue or board of directors. Buck stops there. Next. Okay, again, I hope this sort of makes a little more sense now. This is today's operation. Okay, we know it all began with the trust and the bylaws. Later, we're the Community Corporation, LWCC, we're just taking that and applying it to today's functioning. We have an executive committee, which, as I said, our relations are very close. To me, they have their purpose. Certainly, special committees, we have technology, strategic plan, chartered advisory committees, for instance, government affairs, health, that kind of thing. And by the way, another difference between those two is that the bylaws tell us you have those standing committees. Okay, fine. Membership, you have to allow one person per mutual to join. Okay, so everybody, every mutual can have a representative. The special committees are a little different. They're not They don't stem from bylaws. They're created by the board through a resolution because there is a needed task. And the people, the members on that, they're not necessarily some person from every mutual. They're people who have shown specialty or have specialty in the area that we're looking at. Okay, next. Okay, now, up until now, I've been talking about the Leisure World entities, those 5 entities you just saw. But now, another moving part, but it's not part of Leisure World governance. That one, you know, the groups, clubs, organizations, you know, say I'm in LAWAC, or we have, you know, artsy stuff, whatever. All these are approved by ENR. They're as clubs that we authorize. They're not part of our governance. There's almost 100 of them. That would make a really big bureaucracy if they're part of government. So they're not. I said if they have to be approved, you have to go through ENR hoops, one of which is to have sufficient membership. I said 30, I think it's 35. Anyway, you can find that out. And ENR they have rules that you have to follow. Most of them are initially to get your club going. And again, like I said, there are about 100 of these groups, whether it be New York people, or I don't know if they still have. They have one from Pittsburgh and one from Boston. But anyway, there are a whole lot. Cultural, sports, techie kind of things, you name it. Next. Okay, I'm only going to touch on this. It's not an entity at all. It's a function. And I touch on it because it's a function that hits you in their wallet, and it happens every year. And I said there's very little intersection between mutuals and mutual governments. This is one of them. It's financial. Okay, when they join the trust, they agree to pay the trust what it needs to operate every month. So what happens in your condo fee, there are 2 charges. The Leachboro facilities fee, which is to run the trust services, your amenities, services, everything you get. And it's the same for every unit. That's why when you hear Leachboro budget, it's not the total condo fee, it's the Leachboro budget. And everybody pays, every unit pays that, every unit owner. And one thing about the trust, I wish more people knew when they talk about, well, you know, cost is increasing, our condo fees keep going. The trust portion is capped. Okay, it's capped mostly about the consumer price index. There's a formula that they have to follow, and the trust says you've got to follow it. So the trust really is not the portion that's really going up, because it just can't. I think, I mean, you know, it's in the neighborhood of like 3%. The usually is CPI. It does allow us through resolution or a motion to increase that by like 3% more. That's a total of like 6%. You're not going to see much beyond that. So that part of it, the other part of your mutual operations budget, that's the amount that the mutual charges you to run its residential facility. They have a lot of different charges, and with the mutuals, there are a lot of different, I mean, mutuals have some different, the high rises versus the low rise. High rises have elevators, low rises don't. you know, it's one of those things, you just can't, you know, mutuals are all different. So they charge what they need to charge, and as far as, gee, it's getting so expensive to keep them, it's the mutual portion that is uncapped. They can charge whatever, hopefully, only what it takes to run. But that's where you might see things move around a bit. The legible portion of the counter fee is usually pretty static, and it's less than half of what you pay. Let's see, I'm paying, I don't know, $720 a month. Of that, to the legible portion, I'm paying like $217. So typically it's way less than half. And this is important too. We have in, I guess it's August, we have, you know, from the trust, we actually have to give, or bylaws, we have to give a residential forum on the budget. But when you hear about it in August, you're hearing about the final product. Okay, but the budget year begins January 31st, or January 1st. It's already begun, and it begins at the advisory committee level. They're the ones who see the needs of those specific functions, and they start working with the management to let them know their needs. And then towards June, they come up with the structures that they have to feed. But then what happens is, as the summer moves along in the middle of January, the management gets its CPI, the final CPI that they have to use in their calculations. They start to build their budget. Right then, it's not closed, but it's really on the home stretch. Your changes, input should have been given to the advisory committees at that point, not when it's closer to the end. Once it gets closer to the end in the summer, you have some tweaking between the board, management, the budget and finance committee, and then come September, they will actually approve the budget for Leisure World, which is actually then passed on to mutuals, because they have to incorporate that into their budget as to what they charge the residents. So your counter fee is made up of two things: the budget from your mutual and the budget from Leisure World. The budget for all your services and Leisure World, and then your living expenses to run the mutual. Okay. Okay, and like I said at the beginning, it might be reasonably easy for you to say, how on earth can anything get done? There are so many rules and this and that. It can. And these are just examples of things that were, you know, for the betterment of the residents. Up until, I think, 6 or 8 years ago, the bus contract we had, the buses were configured, they had no ramps. They had 3 steps, and all 3 were of different heights. So it was a pain in the neck, aside from one of them being very high. It was sort of dangerous, and there were so many complaints to both security, transportation, and management over there that we can't have this. Our next contract certainly, you know, did the ramps thing, yeah, and then went to the board, but that was sort of a needs of sell, because that had to do with the well-being of residents. Now there was the painting of boulevard crosswalks, and this just shows how the system has it set up at Kenmore. You know, the crosswalks at the mutual along Leisure Road Boulevard, up until a few years ago, they were repainted every so often by the mutual, because that is mutual property. In S&T, our security and transportation, I remember them suggesting, wouldn't it be great if we had them all painted at once, so we don't have tic-tac-toe of different levels of painting. You do it all at once. And we thought, well, yeah, that's a very obviously good idea. Only problem is, the crosswalks on mutual property. We can't do anything on mutual property unless we ask them and get permission. Since it was gonna be money on our dime, it was no-brainer to the mutuals if they all agreed to it. But if we had done that without asking, there would have been a problem. The crosswalk, a couple of years ago, he was a resident up in Mutual 12. He fell down on South Lakeshore Boulevard, across from the Broadwalk. A lot of people, it wasn't a corner, but a lot of people crossed over there to get to the Broadwalk. And he felt in terms of safety, we really should have a crosswalk there. Now, this guy, he knew the system, and he brought it to S&T, the advisory committee. He sold them on it. They brought it to their board. I had to tell you, they didn't sell it. They lost by 1 vote. Only because that particular year, we had a anomaly. Like I said, just didn't want to get expenses in early in the budget year, but we had one come in really late for various good reasons. But and it was for the gate arm thing, the software put in there, the gates. Well, that was felt to be more important for their overall safety. And if something comes up at the last minute in the budget, something else has to be removed. So it did lose. But the point is, he navigated the system very well. He was really close, and there was just that one extenuating reason. And the sound barrier at Mutual 13, this is almost in reverse. I think with the Maryland State Road, there's a certain decibel level above which, if you can prove it's above that, by law, the Maryland has to put up a barrier on their dime. Mutual 13, credit to their president, they did studies to show that it was too much. So the state had to put in barrier walls. And they thought, well, that's good. Down there, George Avenue all the time. Problem is the barrier walls, even though they're on mutual property, they were to replace a perimeter fence that was Leisure property. So all they had to do was ask Leisure to pass a resolution that would avoid the problem with that perimeter fence. They did, it's up, it's working good. So anyway, the point is, you can, if you know the system, you can get things done. And even like I said, number 3, the guy with the crosswalk that didn't eventually happen, but he maneuvered pretty darn well. And frankly, he was a real nice guy, very, very polite. Okay, and I told you, once I got through governance, the best approach to making a change in Leisure Road, I think it's, from what I've seen over a decade, it's really obvious. You have to bring your issue to an advisory committee. You want them to become your mouthpiece. The advisory committees, like I said, are an extension and chartered by the board. So the board is compelled to listen to them and consider what they ask for. So the guy up there who asked for the crosswalk, he went to the advisory committee, convinced them. They became his mouthpiece. Now, by rule, when the advisory committee brings a resolution to the board has to consider it. And if the board thinks, well, it should be even better, we can return it. But in the meantime, tell the board, we have returned it, and this is why. But it won't slip through the cracks. So the best way to get to the board and have your item considered for action, go to your, sell your thing to the advisory committees. Let them become your mouthpiece, and then the board will be compelled to consider it. And they don't have to always do what the advisory committee suggests, but they sure do take it seriously and really need a much better reason if they don't want it. So that's how you don't want to go through it. Get it on the board's agenda through a committee, and then the board must consider it. Next. Okay, I was just in parting, just gonna mention some ongoing projects that now, like I said, the governing documents gave us the parameter. Okay, but the board is massaging towards current needs. So the board has really specifically put these out there. So the new administration building, that I think they start that in the fall, and that's where they're doing the construction of the Club 1 circle roundabout around the church. It'll go down the hill towards the golf course from there, and the golf course renovation. Give them a lot of credit for their patience. For a decade, they've been asking for improvements. But there wasn't as much money coming in from that. And we demanded to see them pick it up. We needed business plans, models, and they came through with all of that. And I'll tell you frankly, over the last 5 years, they're getting close to becoming a cash cow. They've really turned things around. Their renovation, they do half the golf course this spring, they start and then half next year. Strategic plan, that's essentially a roadmap. Where we want to go for the next 10 years. We want to build out 1, 2 things. And I'll just mention about this. The company we had do this, George Mason University, they did it 2.5 years ago, and they did a ton of outreach to the residents. And almost everything except their financial and housing data came from resident input. So I apologize to new residents who weren't here when that happened. Well, eventually you have to put a line in the sand and say, well, we can't make a plan if we keep asking. So they've got a line in the plan now. I think what they're looking at the moment, and going to present at the board this month, is can we get an additional revenue stream by building new units? Now, this is certainly kind of preliminary, and it wouldn't be adding units that would diminish the open space we have. It very well may be adding on top, or different ways, but that's what they're looking at now. And this trust reserve study goes back to, like I said, over time things change. So the trust, when they trust was created, there were certain laws that weren't there then, but they're here now. And one that came up last year was Trust Reserve City, which is hugely valuable. And the need for it was spotlighted by the condo in Florida that collapsed. And after it collapsed, what came to light was these board members, they were kicking reserve needs down the road because they cost money. Even though they were needed, they said, well, let's do it next year. Well, eventually, next year we'll catch up to you. So now the law says, instead, and frankly, the law had been kicking around for a few years before the Florida thing, but that really highlighted why we need it. That's it. Okay, the trust reserves you have been doing, up until now, have been like a guideline. You know, for setting a, you know, we need this much money in case those buildings fall down or something. But it's no longer a guideline. Now we're compelled to do it by law. And that includes each separate mutual and leisure road. Ours right now is ongoing. It's kind of early on, but it's ongoing. But it's very important. Personally, I wish it had been the law years ago, only because, you know, it would have compelled us to really keep our reserves healthy. And you can never understate reserves. Oh yeah, and the automatic gate entrance. That had bumps in the road, COVID, and then some parts didn't work, they had to replace. But the end game is going to be, they'll have the automatic gates on each entrance, the 3, and we will have guards in the front gate because there are other things they do. They won't be sitting there monitoring who comes in and out, because that gate will only rise if you're allowed in. If you have a little RFID tag that will be applied to your car by security when this rolls out. See, when they, you know, after they installed it, they did a little beta testing with a small group of residents. Now they're doing another testing with a larger group. But after that, it's going to really start to roll out. And by the way, like I said, guards will remain up at the main entrance. And they will remain at the Connecticut Avenue entrance. But at some point, they'll be removed from the Norbeck entrance in favor of the gates. Now, of course, there are problems. There are cameras everywhere, and there'll be a button to call the main gate. We got a problem up here. But it was faulted up there. They can get away with no guards. And just to mention, town halls with the general manager are coming up, and I really suggest you check them out, or check one of the 3 out. You have 3 days in a row, March 29th, 30th, 31st. The one on the 29th will also be on Zoom. And you'll need to register with these. Even though they're free, but register at A&R. They let you know how many people are going to be there. It's like how many chairs put out. And then, you know, so they can send you a Zoom invitation. So you want to register with DNR. Well, that's about, let's see, okay, that's all. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If you don't want to come up here, I'll repeat the question so others can hear.
Dr. Chang will bring you the microphone.
Oh, we have one up here on Zoom. I want to know if there's any discussion about mass meters for electricity and water.
Oh, you know, like the master meter, you know, there are two things there. There's the master meter for electricity. It's half of our units, mostly the low rises are in that. The water, though, is not on the master meter. That's for Leisure Road. So those are kind of like apples and oranges. We set them, they're set up differently.
Here's a question.
Okay, you said each member of the board of directors represents 250 units?
Yes.
So that's like rounded up, if you have less than 250 units, you get one representative?
Yeah.
So what do you need to get two representatives? Do you need to go past 375 or do you need 500?
No, just need to go past 250.
So as soon as you have 251, you get two representatives?
Yeah. The weighting, you know, like if ever weighting is involved, but because of that sort of thing. Weighting is the number of units you represent.
Right.
But no, 250 per rep. And if it goes over that, you get another one.
Okay. Could you directly elect that representative rather than having your mutual board select somebody?
The way it's set up, and that's funny you said that, because the question, a real economic question is, why don't you have term limits? Well, for Leisure World to say you can only serve 3 years would essentially be telling a mutual how to operate its governance. We can't do that. But a mutual can do it today. They can decide 3 years, that's it.
I wasn't asking about a term limit, but I was saying, supposing we elect our board, but the board then elects the president,
Right.
and the president then decides either he or she will send a representative
Right.
instead of her actually or him actually attending.
Right. What they typically do to assign the rep is after the annual meeting at the end when they elect the board gets together, organizational meeting, and elect a representative. Yes, it could be done other ways. But that's how it's being done. And I always looked at it as like, said Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, if she's elected by the popular vote as a congressperson, then Congress, as a body, elects her. So like we're essentially kind of doing the same thing. The body's electing. I mean, ultimately, you know, because if you don't want to vote for that rep, don't vote for him as a director. But that's how it's set up. And yes, it could be done other ways. But
Yeah.
this is how it works.
And then you were talking about the clubs have to be approved by, you said E&R, your slide said E&R, but is it E&R committee or the E&R department?
It's both. The first thing you have to go through in our staff, and they want to see what your committee is all about. They demand us a list of at least 35 people. Once that's okay, they'll bounce it over to the E&R committee, which will interview the person from the committee about what it's about. And then a month later, they'll take their vote. And then you go, and then you have to have your organizational meeting to decide on bylaws, officers, charter, that kind of thing. And then you're good.
So it's not actually the E&R department, as long as it meets the requirements. It's really the E&R subcommittee.
Well, like I said, it's both. If you have the E&R said they demand you have enough members. Okay, so the ball goes there first, and then you gotta go through the committee. So it's sort of both, but it's all
In other words, but the E&R department could not kill a club
no.
if the subcommittee has approved it.
They're the ones who actually vote to approve.
That's my point. Okay.
So we have another question? Simone?
My questions within the HOA showed that the one section where the mutual decides to raise different parts of the HOA depending on their business needs. But then in the up on top, it said the Leisure World facilities portion of your HOA was capped. Does that mean it's been capped at a certain dollar amount since the 60s? Or does it,
Yeah.
do they adjust it?
Yeah, but the cap changes every year depending on the consumer price index. So let's say it's capped and tied to the CPI. But that happens every year. I think it's the government something office determines what we have to use their number in June. The middle of June, they give us the number that we'll use for the CPI. Because they have different CPIs for different areas in the country. The one that we use for this area comes out in the middle of June that will you finalize in our budget.
Okay.
But yeah, every year there's a cap.
Okay. I read it as being capped and no adjustments ever made to it, and I was just.
Oh, I'm
that's
sorry,
just-
no, it's not a,
It just seems awfully
static cap. It's-
odd that it would be capped since the 60s. Okay, thank you.
And by the way, the people who are on the board, who determine that budget a lot of times, we're residents too, so we have skin in the game to keep these counter fees down. You know, so if it goes up, it was painful for us too. Any other questions?
John, did you have any other questions
No,
from
no.
Zoom?
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, keep in mind that email, if something pops in your mind, gfat@lwm10.com. Just email me anytime.
Okay. And please be sure to pick up a brochure from the Center for Lifelong Learning, and we look forward to seeing you at our next community conversation. And if you don't know John Feldman, our president, he's here staffing the Zoom work. Yes.